Hello, and welcome to Nightfall History. Tonight we are not following one king, one battle, or one empire. Instead, we are stepping into a far more dangerous experiment comparing to completely different ways of living inside the same civilization. On one side stood Sparta, stern discipline, suspicious of comfort, allergic to luxury, and fully prepared to turn childhood into military preparation. On the other stood Athens, talkative, artistic, argumentative, politically restless, and so in love with debate that if given the chance, an Athenian could probably turn breakfast into a public philosophical dispute. Both cities were Greek. Both worshiped the Olympian gods. Both produced warriors, leaders, and legends. And yet, if you had been born in one instead of the other, your life could have unfolded in almost every possible opposite way. To understand ancient Greece, you must understand this contrast, because Athens and Sparta were not simply rival cities. They were rival ideas of civilization. Ancient Greece is often imagined today as one unified world of marble temples, heroic statues, philosophers in white robes, and muscular men discussing democracy under olive trees. And yes, some of that did exist, but the reality was far more divided. The Greek world was made up of independent city-states, polis, each jealous of its freedom, proud of its customs, and quite capable of thinking that every other Greek city was doing life incorrectly. And in this crowded, competitive world, no two cities came to symbolize deeper differences than Athens and Sparta. Athens stood in Attica, close to the sea, open to trade, influence, and movement. It was a city of harbors, ships, workshops, markets, public speeches, and restless political energy. Wealth flowed in and out. Foreigners passed through. Ideas arrived. Artists, philosophers, merchants, and politicians all competed for attention. It was the sort of place where someone could give a speech, start an argument, write a tragedy, fund a temple, insult a politician, and buy imported wine all in the same afternoon. Sparta was something else entirely. It lay inland in Laconia, in the valley of the Eurotas River, surrounded by mountains and wide fertile land. It was less outward-facing, less commercially flamboyant, and far more tightly controlled. Where Athens was noisy, Sparta was reserved. Where Athens displayed brilliance, Sparta displayed restraint. Where Athens often seemed to be saying, "Look how much we can create," Sparta seemed to be saying, "Look how much we can endure." Even their geography seems to mirror their character. Athens looked outward to the sea. Sparta looked inward toward order. This difference mattered because geography shapes habit and habit shapes culture. Athens, with its access to maritime trade, became a naval power and a center of exchange. Its wealth, its empire, and much of its confidence were tied to ships, silver, and commerce. The city lived in contact with the wider Mediterranean world. Sparta built its power differently. It was a land power grounded in conquest and control. Its system depended heavily on the labor of the helots, an unfree population, especially numerous in Messenia, whom the Spartans had subjugated. These helots worked the land and supported the Spartan citizen class, and they outnumbered the Spartans dramatically. That fact haunted everything. Sparta was not merely a city that admired discipline because discipline looked impressive in poetry. Sparta needed discipline because its whole social structure stood on a dangerous imbalance. A small ruling citizen class governed a much larger laboring population. If Spartan citizens became soft, divided, lazy, or politically unstable, the entire system could collapse. So Sparta organized itself around control. Control of the body, control of appetite. Control of speech, control of fear. Control of childhood. Control of citizens, and of course control of everyone who was not a citizen. Athens also used slavery, and deeply so. It was not some shining land of universal freedom. Enslaved people worked in homes, mines, workshops, and households there too. But Athens did not build its identity around the same total militarized fear of internal revolt that shaped Sparta. Athens had factions, class tensions, imperial ambitions, and political chaos, plenty of chaos, in fact, sometimes enough to suggest that democracy had discovered caffeine. But its daily life was not organized around turning every citizen into part of a permanent internal security structure, and this single difference had enormous consequences. If you asked an Athenian and a Spartan the same basic question, "What is a citizen?" for their answers would not simply vary in wording. They would reveal to different worlds. To an Athenian, a citizen was at least ideally someone who participated in politics and legal life, in public debate, in military service when needed, and in the civic life of the polis. Citizenship meant presence, voice, argument, and visibility. To a Spartan, citizenship meant something far narrower and far harsher. A citizen was part of a warrior elite, disciplined, obedient, militarily capable, and socially molded to preserve the state. Athens admired persuasion. Sparta admired obedience. Athens valued cleverness. Sparta valued steadiness. Athens believed that speech could shape public life. Sparta often behaved as if too much speech was the beginning of disaster. This contrast extended into nearly everything. Athens produced playwrights, sculptors, architects, philosophers, and political theorists. It became the city of Socrates, Pericles, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes. It argued with itself constantly and somehow considered this both exhausting and healthy. Sparta produced fewer artists and fewer philosophers, but it produced something else, a reputation for severe order so powerful that the whole Greek world could not ignore it. It became the city of Leonidas, of disciplined phalanxes of boys, trained in hardship, of men expected to die before fleeing. Athens became famous for asking questions. Sparta became famous for having already decided the answer, and perhaps nowhere. Is that difference clearer than in the way the two cities understood education? To Athens, education meant forming a complete citizen, someone who could speak, reason, appreciate music, and poetry, train the body, and participate in public life. The ideal Athenian was not merely strong. He was articulate, socially aware, and capable of persuasion. To put it simply, Athens wanted a man who could fight if necessary, but who could also argue about justice afterward. Sparta wanted something else. Sparta wanted a man who would hold the line. That single phrase almost summarizes the whole civilization. A Spartan was not trained for self-expression. He was trained for endurance, discipline, collective identity, and service to the state. If Athens cultivated versatility, Sparta cultivated reliability. If Athens prized brilliance, Sparta prized control. And because of that, childhood in each city looked radically different. An Athenian boy generally remained within the household, and if his family had means, received education in reading, music, athletics, and rhetoric. He was being prepared to move through a world of public life, civic participation, and cultural refinement. Not every Athenian lived like a philosopher, of course. Many did not spend their mornings debating ethics and their afternoons composing tragedy, but the ideal still mattered. The city admired cultivated intelligence. A Spartan boy, by contrast, could expect something far harsher. At around the age of 7, he left the home and entered the agoge, the Spartan system of communal education and discipline. There he would be hardened through hunger, cold, competition, physical hardship, limited clothing, little comfort, and endless supervision. The goal was not breadth, it was resilience. A Spartan boy was not being prepared to become charming at dinner. He was being prepared to survive fear, pain, and exhaustion without embarrassing the city. And even that description almost sounds gentler than the reality, because Spartan life did not simply value toughness. It distrusted softness. This difference between the two cities also shaped how they thought about beauty and success. Athens loved visible achievement. Temples rose on the Acropolis, sculpture flourished. Drama became one of the great achievements of world civilization. Wealth could be displayed, reputation could be cultivated, and public life often had something theatrical about it. Sparta was almost the opposite. Public luxury was discouraged. Simplicity was honored. Speech was brief. Food was plain. Citizens ate in communal messes. The city seemed to regard ornament as something dangerously close to weakness. If Athens wanted to be admired, Sparta wanted to be respected or feared. The contrast even touched the rhythm of ordinary conversation. Athenians could debate endlessly, and they did. Spartans cultivated brevity, the famous laconic style. To say much in Sparta was often seen as unnecessary, even suspicious. Why waste 10 words when one sharp sentence could do the job? An Athenian might give a speech to prove intelligence. A Spartan might give a sentence to prove control. One can almost imagine the Athenians inventing philosophy while the Spartans stood nearby wondering why no one had simply said the answer already and gone home. And yet both cities believed they represented the best of Greece. That is part of what made their rivalry so powerful. This was not merely a contest for territory or prestige. It was a contest between two moral visions. Athens believed in the value of civic participation, intelligence, artistic refinement, and public argument. Sparta believed in strength, discipline, sacrifice, and the subordination of the individual to collective need. Each city saw the other as flawed. Too many Athenians, Sparta was rigid, culturally limited, suspicious of thought, and almost inhumanly severe. Too many Spartans, Athens was unstable, overindulgent, talkative, politically chaotic, and far too fond of comfort. Each city could point to the other and say, in effect, this is what happens when people choose the wrong virtues. And so the comparison begins not with war, but with daily life. What kind of child were you allowed to be? What kind of adult were you expected to become? What kind of city surrounded you? What did your family matter? What did your body matter? What did your voice matter? And who in the end did your life belong to? Yourself, your household, or the state? Those questions lead us directly into the most intimate level of the contrast between Athens and Sparta. Because before these two cities fought each other on land and sea, they had already been fighting over the meaning of a human life. And in childhood, education, family, and everyday expectations, that difference becomes sharper than ever. If you wanted to see the deepest difference between Sparta and Athens, you would not begin on a battlefield. You would begin with a child, because the two cities did not simply produce different armies or different political systems. They produced different human beings, or at least they tried very hard to. Let us imagine the boys born in the same century, both Greek, both free, both from citizen families. One opens his eyes in Athens, the other in Sparta. They will grow up under the same sky, hear the same mispray to many of the same gods, and one day perhaps stand in armor like other Greek men. But almost everything between birth and adulthood will teach them different lessons about what life is for. In Athens, the boy remains in the household. His family is the center of his early world. He grows up in a city that values education not only for usefulness, but for cultivation. If his family has the means, he may be taught reading, writing, music, poetry, athletics, and later, rhetoric. He learns Homer, perhaps some lyre, perhaps some wrestling, perhaps enough arithmetic to function. And if he is especially fortunate, he may hear older men discussing law, politics, and philosophy. The Athenian ideal is not simply strength, it is balance. The Greeks called it paideia, the formation of the whole person. A good Athenian citizen should be physically fit, yes, but he should also know how to speak reason, appreciate beauty, and participate in civic life. He is not being raised merely to endure. He is being raised to function in a city that talks, votes, argues, judges, persuades, and performs. Athens wanted men who could stand in the assembly and make a case. Sparta wanted men who could stand in a line and not move. That difference alone could fill a lifetime. A Spartan boy, unlike his Athenian counterpart, did not remain safely within the rhythms of home for long. At around the age of 7, he entered the agoge, the state-controlled system of upbringing and discipline for male citizens. If the Athenian child was still learning songs, letters, and polite civic formation, the Spartan child was already being pulled away from family life and placed under communal supervision. And here the contrast becomes brutal. Athenian boys could be disciplined, certainly. Ancient parents were not soft in the modern sense, and Greek education was not a free-floating paradise of gentle creativity, but compared to Sparta, Athens looks almost luxurious. Spartan boys were given minimal clothing, often one cloak for the year. They went barefoot. They slept on rough bedding made from reeds. They were underfed on purpose so that hunger would teach resourcefulness. They were watched, constantly punished, publicly, and trained to endure hardship without complaint. In Athens, a teacher might correct your grammar. In Sparta, life itself corrected your entire personality. Spartan boys were also encouraged to steal food, but punished if they were caught, not because theft itself was seen as admirable, but because stealth, cunning, and competence were useful. The lesson was very Spartan: failure is shameful, and the world has no obligation to reward innocence. If incompetence gets you caught, an Athenian educator might ask whether a boy understood the lines of Homer. A Spartan supervisor might ask whether he could survive on almost nothing and still keep his dignity. This is not simply a contrast in methods. It is a contrast in the imagined purpose of childhood. For Athens, childhood was preparation for civic participation. For Sparta, childhood was the first stage of state discipline. The Athenian boy was being prepared to speak. The Spartan boy was being prepared to obey. And yet Athens was not, of course, some universally educated democracy in the modern sense. Education depended heavily on class, wealth, and status. Poorer boys had more limited opportunities. Many would not become polished speakers or cultured amateurs of poetry. Much of Athenian greatness rested on inequalities of its own, but the ideal still mattered. The city admired the articulate citizen. In Sparta, the ideal was much narrower and much harsher. What about girls? Sure, again, the two cities diverged sharply. In Athens, women of citizen families were expected to live much more privately than men. Respectable Athenian women were associated above all with the household. Their lives centered on marriage, family management, textile production, religion, and domestic order. They had important roles, but not equal public roles. They did not participate in the assembly. They did not debate policy. They were expected to remain largely within the world of the oikos, the household. An Athenian woman, especially from a respectable citizen household, was not meant to live publicly. She was meant to be protected, controlled, and largely unseen. Spartan women, by contrast, lived under a very different set of expectations. They still did not hold political office in the way female citizens did, and Sparta was no feminist utopia in sandals. But compared with Athens, Spartan women had significantly more visibility, more mobility, and more influence over property and household management. They were expected to be physically strong, to exercise and to uphold the values of the city with unusual directness. This difference often astonished other Greeks. To Athenians, Spartan women could seem loud, bold, and shockingly unconstrained. They were said to speak more freely and move more openly than women. In most other Greek cities, this was not because Sparta believed in equality in any modern sense. It was because the city wanted strong mothers, strong households, and women capable of sustaining a militarized society while men lived much of their lives under public discipline. In other words, Spartan women had more room, but not because Sparta was gentle. They had more room because Sparta needed them to help run the machine. Athenian women were more restricted, but they were also less deeply integrated into a total military culture. Spartan women could command respect in ways unusual for Greece. but that respect was tied to their role in reproducing and defending Spartan values. If an Athenian woman was expected to preserve the household, a Spartan woman was expected to preserve the household and the warrior ethos. One can almost hear the difference in household conversation. In Athens, have you learned your letters? In Sparta, have you learned not to complain nowhere? Is the contrast more vivid than in the meaning of education itself? The Athenian system aimed at versatility. Music mattered, poetry mattered, athletics mattered, speech mattered. There was an assumption, especially among elite Athenians, that a good citizen should be capable of many things. Even physical education in Athens existed as part of a broader civic ideal. The body was trained, yes, but so was the mind. The Spartan system was much less interested in intellectual variety. Spartan boys did learn some music and some literacy, but these were not central in the way they were in Athens. The primary aim was moral and military conditioning. Hunger, pain, competition, silence, and obedience were not side effects. They were the curriculum. Athens believed the city needed men who could think publicly. Sparta believed the city needed men who could suppress the self. The effects of this extended into adulthood. An Athenian man moved through a city filled with talk. He could hear speeches in the courts, debates, in the assembly gossip, in the marketplace performances in the theater, at philosophical discussions in public places. His city assumed that public speech was a civic necessity. To persuade was to wield power. To speak well was almost a weapon in itself, though a weapon that involved fewer spears and far more wounded egos. A Spartan man, by contrast, was trained to value brevity. The famous laconic style was not simply a cultural joke. It reflected a moral ideal: speak clearly, speak briefly, and do not waste words. Athenian public life often rewarded verbosity. Spartan public life distrusted it. If an Athenian would build a staircase out of argument to reach his point, a Spartan preferred to kick the door open and say the point in 5 words. This difference shaped politics, though we will come to that more fully in the next part. For now, it is enough to say that Athens was a city that turned speech into power. Sparta was a city that turned restraint into power. Even leisure looked different. Athens, especially in its most famous period, cultivated drama, festivals, philosophy, art, and competitive cultural life. The theater was not just entertainment, it was part of civic identity. Men watched tragedies and comedies that explore pride, war, grief, family, politics, and the absurdity of being human. That last one, incidentally, is something Spartans probably would have found suspiciously Athenian to much reflection. Not enough marching. Sparta did not ignore religion, music, or ritual. It had ceremonies, festivals, and choral traditions of its own, but its cultural energy was directed less toward creativity and more toward reinforcement of social order. Athenian culture often expands, Spartan culture often narrows, and even food tells the same story. Athens had markets, imported goods, fish, olives, wine, breads, and a lively urban economy. The city was connected to trade networks and maritime exchange. It was not a gourmet paradise, but it offered variety. The presence of commerce shaped appetite. Sparta was famously austere. Communal meals for men, plain food, the notorious black broth, and a public disdain for luxury all reinforced the same message: pleasure is dangerous if it weakens discipline. Athens allowed room for enjoyment. Sparta treated too much enjoyment like a crack in the wall. This carried over into the meaning of success. In Athens, success could mean many things: a military victory, a persuasive speech, a political office, a dramatic triumph, a philosophical school, a beautiful building, a public monument, or a reputation for wit and intelligence. All could enhance status. In Sparta, the path was narrower. Success meant discipline, military reliability, social conformity, and freedom from disgrace. It was not that Spartans had no pride. On the contrary, they had immense pride, but it was directed through far fewer acceptable channels. A brilliant but eccentric Athenian could still be admired. A brilliant but eccentric Spartan would risk looking dangerously unlike a Spartan. And then there's the question of the state itself. Athens, for all its chaos, gave adult male citizens a visible role in political life. The citizen mattered because he participated. Sparta gave the citizen a visible role too, but in a more constrained way. He mattered because he belonged to an elite order that preserved the state through military readiness and internal discipline. The Athenian was politically louder, the Spartan was socially tighter. This distinction can be felt almost physically. Athens breathes outward, Sparta compresses inward. And because of that, each city created a different emotional climate. Athens could be unstable, noisy, ambitious, and gloriously overconfident. It was a city capable of brilliance and disaster in almost equal measure. Sparta could be stable, disciplined, severe, and psychologically hard. It inspired fear and admiration, but also unease. One city trusted discussion too much, the other trusted discipline too much. And here is the strange thing: each city was partly right about the other. Athens really could be reckless, divided, and politically chaotic. Sparta really could be rigid, cruel, and suspicious of too much. Human freedom. So would later Greeks and later Historians compare the two. They are not simply choosing between good and bad. They are choosing between different risks built into different ideas of civilization. Do you want a city that encourages brilliance even if brilliance brings instability, or a city that enforces order even if order crushes softness? Athens and Sparta offered opposite answers. And in the next part, those opposite answers will collide in politics, military life, public values, and the rivalry that would eventually help drag the Greek world into one of its greatest internal conflicts. Because once we leave the household and step fully into citizenship, power at war, Athens and Sparta stop being merely different. They become inevitable enemies. Once childhood had done its work, once the household had shaped the boy, and the city had begun to claim the man, the differences between Athens and Sparta became impossible to miss. Because adulthood in these two cities was not simply a matter of age, it was a matter of purpose. In Athens, an adult male citizen entered a world of participation. He could vote in the assembly, serve on juries, argue in court, speak in public, and influence the direction of the city. This did not mean every Athenian became a statesman or philosopher. Many were farmers, craftsmen, traders, sailors, and ordinary citizens, trying to survive the same basic human problems that have always existed: taxes, ambition, public nonsense, and the suspicion that the loudest man in the room probably should not be in charge. In that sense, Athens was already surprisingly modern. But the principle mattered. The city expected the citizen to be visible. To be a man in Athens was at least ideally to have a voice. The assembly could gather thousands of citizens. Men stood, proposed, objected, persuaded, and condemned. Policy was debated publicly. Work could be argued over. Alliances could be challenged. Leaders could rise and fall through speech. It was noisy, unstable, sometimes reckless, often brilliant, and probably exhausting for anyone who liked quiet meals. Sparta offered something very different. Adult male Spartans were indeed citizens, but their citizenship was much more tightly structured and far less openly expressive. Political power existed, yes, kings, efforts, the Gerousia, the assembly of citizens, but the tone was not one of theatrical persuasion. Spartan public life was built around continuity, restraint, and the preservation of order. Debate existed, but not with the same theatrical energy as in Athens. A Spartan citizen did not prove himself by dazzling the public with long speeches. He proved himself by discipline, reliability, and service to the state. If an Athenian politician might rise through rhetoric, a Spartan was expected to rise by being the sort of man who did not need 10 minutes to say what could be said in 10 words, or 5, or ideally a very meaningful silence. The contrast here is profound. Athens believed that political life should engage the citizen mind. Sparta believed that political life should preserve the citizen body. This shaped military life too. Now, at first glance, both cities fielded hoplites, both fought in Greek ways, and both understood courage. But the military culture of each city differed greatly in both structure and emotional meaning. For Athens, military service was part of citizenship, but it existed alongside many other civic roles. An Athenian might row in the fleet, serve as a hoplite, participate in politics, attend festivals, work his land, manage trade, and serve on a jury. Military identity was important, but it was not the only identity. For Sparta, military service was much closer to the core of manhood itself. The Spartan male citizen had been shaped toward this from childhood. His body habits, diet, education, and social world all pointed toward military usefulness and collective discipline. Spartan men ate together in communal messes, trained together, and lived much of life within structures that reinforced cohesion. The city did not merely ask them to fight when needed. It made fighting or readiness to fight one of the deepest justifications of citizenship. This gave Sparta extraordinary strength. In one particular domain, the disciplined hoplite line, it also gave it extraordinary rigidity, because a culture that trains men primarily to hold formation can become very good at holding formation, but not automatically as good at innovation, flexibility, naval improvisation, or broader civic creativity. Sparta was brilliant at producing steadiness. Athens was far better at producing adaptability, and that matters, because history does not always reward the city that stands firm in the old way. Sometimes it rewards the city that can think faster, build more ships, persuade more allies, and change course before disaster arrives. Athens, for all its instability, excelled at energy. Sparta, for all its discipline, excelled at control. The best symbol of Athenian power was probably the fleet. The best symbol of Spartan power was the phalanx. Athenian triremes required rowers, organization, funding harbors, empire, and maritime confidence. They reflected a city tied to the sea, commerce, and movement. The Spartan phalanx reflected a land-based, disciplined, compact, mutually dependent warrior society. One city expanded through networks, the other through cohesion. Even their public values reflected this difference. Athens admired cleverness. Sparta admired composure. Athens could tolerate and often reward originality, verbal skill, and even a degree of personal eccentricity. A city that produced Socrates was clearly willing to live with unusual men even if it later made deeply questionable decisions about them. Athens liked minds that challenged things right up until the point when those minds became too inconvenient, which is a very Athenian contradiction. Sparta was less tolerant of eccentricity. It preferred the reliable citizen to the dazzling individual. Its ideal man was not unusual. He was sound. He fit the pattern. He strengthened the line. In modern language, Athens often rewarded the man who stood out. Sparta rewarded the man who stayed in place. And now we come to perhaps the most revealing contrast of all. What did each city think life was for? An Athenian answer in its highest form might include politics, reputation, beauty, philosophy, civic contribution, memory, and achievement. Life was not merely survival. It was participation in a city that aimed, however imperfectly, at greatness. Through human excellence in many forms, a Spartan answer would sound much narrower and much harder. Life was for duty, for the city, for discipline, for preserving order, for serving a collective way of life that existed before you and was expected to outlast you. The best life was not the most expressive or the most interesting. It was the most useful. This is why the rivalry between Athens and Sparta was never just about strategy or alliances. It was civilizational. Each city represented a different answer to the question of what human excellence meant. Athens answered cultivation, speech, beauty, participation, ambition, thought. Sparta answered endurance, order, obedience, strength, sacrifice, control. And eventually these two answers collided in the Peloponnesian War. This was not simply one city-state attacking another. It was the great fracture within the Greek world. Athens, with its naval empire and democratic energy, stood against Sparta, with its land power and austere oligarchic order. Allies were drawn in. Resources were drained. Plague, revolt, pride, strategy, and miscalculation all played their part. And here the strengths and weaknesses of both systems became painfully visible. Athens showed immense creativity, resilience, and daring. It also showed recklessness, political instability, and a terrible tendency to argue itself into disaster. The Sicilian expedition remains one of history's finest examples of what happens when a city combines confidence, ambition, and just enough bad judgment to turn a very large plan into a very large catastrophe. Sparta showed persistence, discipline, and political steadiness, but it also revealed limits. It was not naturally designed to dominate a conflict. That required naval scale, international financing, and strategic flexibility across a broader theater. To defeat Athens, Sparta had to adapt more than its own image often admits. And that is an important point. Neither city was as simple as its legend. Athens was not merely brilliant and free. Sparta was not merely disciplined and strong. Each was full of contradictions. Athens prized democracy, yet excluded women, foreigners, and enslaved people from that democracy. Sparta prized equality among citizens, yet built that equality on the domination of the helots. Athens celebrated thought, yet could punish the thinker. Sparta celebrated virtue, yet defined virtue so narrowly that much of ordinary human life had to be pressed into silence. Even in their greatest achievements, each city exposes its own limits. Athens gave the world philosophy, drama, political theory, architecture, and an astonishing model of cultural ambition. But it could be unstable, vain, and self-destructive. Sparta gave the world one of history's most unforgettable examples of disciplined citizenship and martial cohesion, but it could be cruel, rigid, and incapable of widening its understanding of human value beyond service to the state. One city risked chaos for brilliance, the other sacrificed breadth for order, and perhaps that is why the comparison still fascinates us, because in truth most societies still live somewhere between Athens and Sparta. How much freedom should a state allow before it becomes unstable? How much order should a state impose before it becomes inhuman? How much should education cultivate individuality? How much should it cultivate discipline? How much comfort is healthy? How much softness becomes weakness? Show much severity becomes cruel? Athens and Sparta answered those questions at opposite extremes. Athens said, let the citizen speak. Sparta said, let the citizen endure. Athens produced artists, philosophers, sailors, and demagogues. Sparta produced warriors, disciplined mothers, silent boys, and a reputation so severe that the whole Greek world remembered it with a mix of fear and admiration. And yet in the end, neither city escaped history. Athens lost its empire, its certainty. Sparta lost its supremacy, and eventually much of the social structure that had made it unique. Time reduced both cities from living powers into examples, symbols, and arguments for later ages. But if we ask which city gave human beings more room to breathe, the answer is surely Athens. And if we ask which city forged harder men, the answer is surely Sparta. The problem, of course, is that human beings need both strength and room to breathe. That may be the final lesson of this comparison. Athens reminds us that civilization without discipline can become unstable, vain, and overconfident. Sparta reminds us that discipline without openness can become cold, narrow, and oppressive. One city teaches the danger of too much freedom without restraint. The other teaches the danger of too much restraint without freedom. So if you had been born in Athens, you might have lived in a louder, more expressive, more intellectually alive world, but also a more chaotic and politically dangerous one. If you had been born in Sparta, You might have lived in a society of extraordinary cohesion, purpose, and martial pride, but at the cost of softness, privacy, individuality, and much of what makes life richly human. Athens would teach you to speak. Sparta would teach you to hold your tongue. Athens would ask what you think. Sparta would ask what you can endure. And between those two questions lies one of the greatest contrasts in all of history. Thank you for listening to Nightfall History. As the lamps go dim over ancient Greece and the voices of Athens and Sparta fade into the distance, one truth remains: civilizations do not only build cities, they build ways of being human. And few ever did it more differently or more memorably than Athens and Sparta.